I'm back, again, and this time in less than a calendar year. I'm continuing my review of the Rippaverse comics. I was happy to see all the comments and likes I got on the previous video, so if you like this video, leave a like and a comment, maybe even subscribe, because I'm going to be continuing to cover these comics as they come out. This time I'm reviewing Yaira number 1, and I think I picked a good time to get into these because Yaira number 1 dropped right after my review came out. I'm probably not going to go into as much detail of the plot as I did for Isom 1 and 2, but I will be spoiling the plot nonetheless. So same as before, spoiler alert for those who have yet to read it. Right as we open the comic, we're greeted with the familiar Rippaverse code of ethics that has appeared in each of these comics, but now with Yaira next to it. In the very next panel, she kinda reminds me of Super Saiyan 3 Goku a little bit. For those who are completely new to these comics, Yaira was the blonde villain in Isom number 1 that threw Avery into the car and fought with Alpha Corps. And Alpha Corps, for those who don't remember, are the super police that deal with Accepts, who are the supers of this universe. Following the timeline from Isom 1 to Yaira number 1 is really simple because this story picks up immediately as Avery hits the car. Yaira hovers over Avery and tells him not to follow her. Alpha Corps moves in to apprehend her because, well, she just threw a civilian into a car. Solari orders Braxwell to check in on Avery as he and Ingrid Valdez go in on an attempt to arrest Yaira. This would prove to be a mistake, however, as Yaira is apparently more than a match for both Solari and Valdez. This is something I thought was kinda weird. From Solari's point of view, why would you bring in Valdez in an attempt to arrest Yaira? He's fought her before to a standstill, and he knows she's hard to take down. Valdez can't fly, but Yaira, Solari, and Braxwell all do. So Solari's literally having to carry Valdez. Seems kinda odd to bring a non-flyer with you to take down a flying adversary when you also had a guy with you that can also fly. Solari and Valdez fight with Yaira for a bit, and they seemingly almost have her for a minute before she creates this whirlwind that throws all of them either into very low orbit or really high into the stratosphere. Oxygen is scarce here, and Solari and Valdez can't fight very well. Yaira is seemingly unaffected though, and drops kick Valdez, and is able to make Solari pass out. I'm not really sure how either of them survived this, but the panel zooms out to a news broadcast of Yaira flying away. Evidently this happened some time ago, and Alpha Corps is now dealing with the negative press of a criminal having escaped. These guys just can't catch a break. If you remember, in Alpha Corps 1, Solari put an unmarked USB stick in the main computer on board their airship, and someone got killed, and probably caused millions of dollars of damage to the city. And now they can't even catch superpowered bad guys without them getting away. On the news report, Solari is vowing to find Yaira and bring her to justice. It's interesting, in Alpha Corps, I got a much different vibe from him. Right here in this panel, he's reminding me a bit of J. Jonah Jameson vowing to get Spider-Man. It's a different side to him than the aloof but very confident former military man he was in Alpha Corps number 1. I guess in this situation, Solari has been publicly embarrassed by Yaira. We cut to Yaira, or rather her non-accept identity, Sally, speaking at Projexis. She's been hired on as an archaeologist/biologist, an odd combination that one of the other scientists working there also notes as being strange. I posed a question in my last review about the nature of Projexis itself. It wasn't super clear what Projexis is, and I made a note of the fact that it might become a problem for me if Projexis is going to factor into the story heavily going forward. I seem to have an answer now. Projexis is some sort of advanced research facility. I'm still not really sure why they have such militarized security forces, but one question at a time, I suppose. We cut away from Yaira at Projexis to a nearby parking garage where 4 gunmen are holding up a bank truck. There are 4 bandits, 3 males and 1 woman. The driver is completely at their mercy, when one of the bandits notes that these guys usually work in pairs. Just then, the driver's partner appears and begins shooting at the bandits. A firefight ensues and 3 of the bandits are killed, and the woman bandit is also wounded. She sees her partners on the ground and begins to rage. The sight of her downed friends is enough to send blue light shooting from her eye sockets. We zoom out to space and see the blue light from her eyes traveling across the galaxy. A couple of strange figures in space notice this and say, "Ah, there you are, Yaira. Thought you could hide from us forever." And they begin traveling towards the source of the blue light on Earth. Back on Earth, this blue light incident takes us to the moment from that Yaira live-action trailer where Yaira was beating up that random lady. Now we have a little more context to that. There is complete pandemonium and chaos from that woman shooting those blue lights from her eyes. The entire parking garage where she and her friends were robbing that bank truck is destroyed, along with the wall out to the street. The inside of the garage is now filled with ice as well. Yaira punches this woman, whose name is Stefania, by the way. We'll learn that a little later, but I want something to refer to her as right now. Yaira mentions how Stefania withstood her punch admirably, story, and she asks where she got her powers from exactly. When I was first reading this, I didn't really follow why Yaira was doing any of this, but it actually makes a little more sense later on in the story. Anyways, Yaira keeps asking Stefania where she got her powers from. Stefania has another episode similar to when she was inside the parking garage and punches Yaira back, actually sending Yaira flying back a bit. Yaira's a bit surprised by this, but she's also a bit tougher than Stefania and yells that now she's starting to get mad. But before Yaira can go back to Stefania, those mysterious figures from space interrupt. There are two humanoid-looking people in robes and a very strange, large bug man. They claim that they are here to bring Yaira to justice for her many crimes and that she can't hide from them any longer. Yaira goes to Stefania, who is shocked at the appearance of these others, and Yaira asks Stefania if she wants to die tonight. Stefania remembers her friends in the parking garage and says that no, she doesn't want to die. Then Yaira says, okay, then go hide while I talk to them. The talk Yaira attempts to have with the three aliens very quickly breaks down into violence. This is a theme you'll notice a lot as we go forward. I said previously that Isam was kind of hot-headed, but Yaira is probably more so. Or in this case, tactically hot-headed. Yaira fights with the space people and the bug man while Stefania runs away. Now, bear with the story just a little bit. At first when I was reading this, I was really wondering why Yaira is doing any of this at all. Yaira isn't an Alpha Corps member or even a superhero. Remember, she threw Avery through a car for really no reason. I didn't really understand why she was 1, involving herself with Stefania at all, and 2, was trying to save Stefania from these mysterious space people and Bugman. But like I said, it'll make a little more sense later on. Yaira is fighting these bug people and she's getting kind of beaten up. They seem to have similar powers to Yaira. We cut to Stefania, who's run away and is trying to hotwire a car to escape. Just as she begins to drive though, the bug man named Numite, it's an odd name, like termite or something. The bugman breaks into the car and begins releasing smaller bugs to attack her. Yaira shows up and rescues Stefania and begins drawing the attention once again of all three of the aliens while Stefania escapes. This is part of Yaira's plan, but what wasn't part of her plan is how overwhelmed she is by all three of the adversaries at the same time. They just begin absolutely kicking Yaira into next week. While this is happening, we cut to Alpha Corps at their headquarters just watching all this happen on a monitor. Valdez notes that their power levels are unprecedented. She asks Solari if they should engage and he says no. Let's go after the one who escaped, referring to Stefania. Now I will say that Solari is being a bit more cautious than he normally is, but this seems really odd since Alpha Corps was supposed to be 5 minutes out. But here, they're all just watching this play out instead. This also goes against the events in the live-action trailer a little bit, since that version ended with Solari showing up. I mean, I guess we never technically saw Solari, so maybe the voice we heard was then supposed to be one of these aliens. But anyways, back to Yaira getting beaten up. She's getting absolutely pulverized by the three of these aliens who are each individually seemingly an even match for her. She flies away and they follow her, all the way out of the city and into a field with an oil drill. Yaira lures them closer to the oil drill that they must not know anything about since they're aliens, and she blows it up as a way of hurting them. This plan of hers has a lot of collateral damage, but hey, she's not a super cop and she's not really a superhero, so she doesn't really have to worry about it. It allowed her to escape from those three for the time being, so that's good enough for her. Hopefully no one died. Hard cut to the next scene. We're in a retirement home for some reason, and we're watching footage of the carnage of the oil rig explosion on the news with some old people. I noticed that this news coverage scene transition has happened twice so far in this comic. Not really a criticism, just interesting. Yaira is here at this retirement home in disguise to visit someone, and I just have to point something out. Yaira is really tall, but I feel like she's being drawn like she's 7 feet tall here. Canonically, Yaira is supposed to be 6'3". Granted, she's wearing heels, but they're not platforms or anything. My point in mentioning this is, well, how effective would her disguises really be? She's a giant blonde woman. I guess it's just an accepted trope in the superhero genre, kinda like when Clark Kent turns into Superman by just taking off his glasses. Yaira's identity is going to be interesting though, because of something that happens a little later on. But for now, she's in this retirement home to see someone, an old woman who immediately exclaims her name upon seeing her. Yaira tells her,
"No, really? It wasn't me." "What? But it was." "Sorry."
The old woman introduces herself as Carmen Martinez and begins going into a story her great-grandmother told her about a goddess that came to Earth and experienced pain before vowing to never experience pain like that again. It might seem like this old woman is just not all there anymore, but Yaira is a good listener and asks her question about the story. Yaira takes Carmen out of the retirement home and to her house, I guess she's just allowed to do that, and shows her various items from antiquity she's gathered. Carmen once again calls her Yaira, and this time says that she knows exactly exactly what Yaira is and what she wants, but she just wants Yaira to keep Stefania safe. Carmen is Stefania's grandmother, and Yaira asks her if she knows if Stefania has ever shown signs of these new powers ever before. Carmen is confused by this, giving Yaira the answer she was looking for. These powers Stefania has are new. Another hard cut to a news scene, but this time no news coverage. Stefania is back with her gang, or at least with different members of her gang. She's showing off her new powers to her gang, and everyone is becoming really excited at the prospect of using Stefania's new powers to rob people and plan more heists. The celebration is cut off early though when Alpha Core arrives and quickly knocks out her and her friends and arrests them all. I mentioned back in my ISOM 2 review that there was a lot going on, but I feel like there's way more going on in Yaira number 1 with all these cuts, and we're barely a third of the way in. We cut again, but now back to the 2 aliens and the bug creature in a cave planning their revenge on Yaira. Yanessa, the woman alien, is horribly burned from the oil rig explosion from earlier. The 3 of them are recuperating in this cave, trying to plan their course of action. The bug says that he'll deal with Yaira though, and he unleashes these bugs from himself that swarm towards Fluorspark. We cut back to Stefania in an interrogation room with Solari. Solari wants answers as to how she knows Yaira. He wants to know how Yaira was able to give Stefania her powers. Stefania, though, doesn't know what's going on at all. Yaira shows up at the prison as apparently full of accepts. This answers the question I posed in my Alpha Core number 1 review about the accept prison system. It seems that accepts are isolated to their own prison ward, but there doesn't seem to be anything special about it. The area the accept prisoners are in has this open floor plan with a vaulted ceiling. The higher floors have balconies that look out to the lower floors. I'm not sure what's stopping any individual accept, like that fire accept Billy Bob from Alpha Core number 1 for example, from just using their powers to torch the whole place through their cell. Yaira arrives to break Stefania out of prison, and we hear a line from the PA system that says, "Containment system compromised." This is an aside, but I really hope that the containment system isn't just some magical narrative device to deactivate people's powers. I've seen something similar in other movies.
Don't bother. The detention room neutralizes all superpowers.
I really dislike this concept on principle. If it's established, like in My Hero Academia, for example, that the nature of someone's powers are something innate to their physiology versus the result of something external like a quirk, then I have an easier time accepting that someone's powers can be turned off. But the idea in general of just turning off someone's powers always seemed really dumb and lazy to me. If powers can just be turned off, then I feel logically society would adapt to superpowered beings by developing weapons to just turn off everyone else's powers. Any story with superheroes would logically devolve into an arms race to deactivate other people's powers. Suddenly the story is no longer about the characters but about the meta. Going back to My Hero Academia again, Eraser's ability to turn off powers is a power itself, and one that has a lot of limitations. It's worse though if the person's powers are something genetic rather than something gifted to them. Imagine there's a character who's like 9 feet tall and super strong, but what if I shoot him with this magical anti-superhero dart? Does he stop being 9 feet tall? Or does he stop being super strong? Was being 9 feet tall his superpower? Or was his being 9 feet tall the result of his super genetics that made him 9 feet tall? What if his super strength was just relative to his size? Does that mean his strength is a superpower that can be deactivated? What if he's just a part of a race of aliens that are all like that? Does this magical anti-superpower dart turn off his being a part of that species? Does the anti-superpower dart turn him into a human? If it's established that someone's powers come from something genetic, then it's just really dumb that it can be turned off. Would that anti-superpower dart turn off a dog's dog genetics and make them a cat? I'm not opposed to a superhero losing their powers if it makes sense. Like the Green Lanterns have their rings that they derive their powers from. It makes sense for them to lose their powers if they lose their rings. Or Shazam, who gets his powers from magic. In that case, it's okay if Shazam loses his powers because of magic, because his powers came from magic to begin with. Or infamously, Superman's weakness to kryptonite is fine because it's established that his race is weakened by it. That's a special weakness unique to Kryptonians. But I think it's dumb if a character that has a super healing factor that is genetic to them can have that healing factor turned off by virtue of just being in a room that has a containment system. I view that as the writer being lazy and not wanting to think of how to deal with the character's superpower in that instance. I prefer clever solutions to imprisoning superpowered characters. Like in Alpha Core 1, the fire accept was disabled by locking him in an enclosed space, causing him to suffocate when he used his powers, effectively disabling him. I guess in a prison you could also make the walls of some special material so he couldn't just burn through it really quickly. Where would you put Benny, the mind control accept from Alpha Core number 1? He'd probably be in solitary confinement, with his food being dropped off by a robot of some kind, something that would be immune to his mind control powers because it's not sentient, and his room would probably require multiple people to enter different keys at the same time to unlock it, so one mind controlled guard wouldn't be able to free him. That to me is better storytelling than just putting him in a magical room where accept powers don't work and don't ask questions as to why they don't work. I want to ask questions in that situation. Does the magical no superpower room have a range? Why not just extend it over the whole building, or the whole block, or the whole city? Then you don't have to worry about any supervillains at all. Having magical no superpower zones or magical disable all superpower guns in stories are lazy literary devices written to get the writer out of a hole they've put themselves in. That being said, I don't know for sure how the accept prison system works here. I really hope it's not just that there's some magical containment system that turns off everyone's powers. But moving right along. That whole thing was a tangent. Yaira starts a prison break to cause a distraction to get Stefania. The prisoners escape and cause mayhem. Solari and Alpha Core move into the prison grounds to restore order, and he begins fighting Yaira. They fight for a while, and once again they seem evenly matched. But Yaira manages to escape in the confusion of the prison riot because Solari is having to deal with a bunch of accept inmates as well. She takes Stefania back to her home where she has her grandma. On the way back, Stefania demands to know what Yaira wants with her and asks Yaira to take the cuffs off of her. Yaira tells her to just take the cuffs off herself, and to Stefania's surprise, she's able to remove them by simply parting her arms away. As Yaira enters her home, she notices those bugs that we saw earlier being released by the bug man in the cave. They're everywhere. Yaira quickly realizes that those bugs must be from that insectoid bug man. The bug man has broken into her house and has killed Carmen, the old woman from the retirement home, Stefania's grandma. Stefania has no idea what's happened. She doesn't know who this bug creature is or why she has powers all of a sudden. All she knows is Yaira told her she had her grandma here and now she's dead. Stefania runs out of the house, fleeing the bug man, but cursing Yaira, directly blaming Yaira for her abuela's death. Yaira doesn't have time to deal with this though. She turns to face the bugman, Mite, but she's swarmed by his many littler bugs. They're eating away at her flesh. She realizes that she's in over her head and she runs away. I've noticed Yaira has been overpowered quite a few times in this story. Anyways, Yaira begins flying away, but the bugman pursues her and shoots her with a lightning bolt? Apparently it's super effective and Yaira goes down with a giant hole in her stomach. Somehow though, in the next panel, Yaira has managed to put her office clothes back on in the midst of bleeding out. Like seriously, Yaira is covered in bite marks from the bugs all over her body and she's tracking blood everywhere as she walks. That's a superpower on its own. She returns back to Projexis, remember that? At the beginning of the comic, she was being hired by Projexis. She returns to Projexis and finds Altona. Altona is shocked to see her basically dying. It's like Yaira's third day of work at this point. Altona helps her out and puts her in a Luke Skywalker / Goku style healing pod. Yaira reveals her true identity to Altona because, well, when Altona put her in the healing pod, she saw that Yaira doesn't really have human organs and is clearly not an ordinary human. The bugs that attack Yaira are swarming all over Fluorspark, but Altona has a plan to rid the city of the swarm. This is the first time so far in these comics that there's been at least a city-level threat. Yaira blew up an oil rig the other day, the trio of villains wrecked a city block, summoned a huge swarm of giant bugs, Yaira staged a prison riot, and now to fix all this, Yaira goes to the middle of the city and summons a giant tempest storm to lure everyone straight to her. The two aliens, the Bugman, and Alpha Core. Alpha Core had since caught up to Stefania after she fled Yaira's house, and they were in the process of trying to talk her into being bait for Yaira, since they know Yaira is after Stefania for some reason unknown to them. But right as Solari is springing this plan, Braxwell and Ingrid notice the snow and thunder outside that is being summoned by Yaira. So the stage is set. Yaira is trying to gather both the aliens to her and Alpha Core at the same time, with her plan being to get the two groups to fight one another, since she's had issues dealing with both groups solo. The aliens and the Bugman arrive first. This is by far my favorite part of the comic. Yaira's about to fight the aliens, and they're doing the superhero, supervillain thing where they square off and they say, "This is the end for you," and the other person person's like, no, this is the end for you, and so on. And then the Bugmen and aliens are interrupted as they get fried by fire from someone. We have a reverse shot in the next panel, and we see Alpha Core and Stefania with her new powers here. Braxwell is holding a bazooka. The aliens are telling Yaira in their alien language that they're going to bring her in to face justice. Apparently Yaira is a criminal everywhere she goes. Solari doesn't speak alien or insectoid though, and he bluntly says, "You're all under arrest." Genuinely, this is a cool sequence. The aliens shoot these beams at Alpha Core. Braxwell and Ingrid are kinda in over their heads a little bit, and they're quickly talking about breaking formation and who they're gonna target first. Braxwell loses his bazooka, and Ingrid moves in to protect him. While this is happening, Yaira talks to Stefania briefly in Spanish to try to keep her conversation private from Solari, who's nearby. She tells her that she only wanted to protect her grandma and to give her a chance to explain what's happening. Stefania, though, isn't convinced and says she doesn't trust her. Solari actually chimes in and says, "Hey, I speak Spanish too. We're in Texas and I'm a cop, remember?" Solari yells at Stefania to run and hide as he charges into combat with the aliens. In the middle of the fight, Altona's plans back at Projexis goes into effect, and she releases these spores out from the Projexis building that are poisonous to the swarm in Fluorspark. This kills the bug swarm that the Bugman released. We see Numite is freaking out that his bugs are dying as Alpha Core is fighting with the other two aliens. Now, I'm a little confused as to the continuity here, because here we see Alpha Core fighting these two aliens, seemingly getting the upper hand in the last panel. But later, everything is going to be reset, and the aliens will be free, and Alpha Core goes home. I'm not really sure why that is. We cut back to Yaira with Stefania back at Projexis. They snuck away during the fight, and Yaira tells her she'll explain to Stefania how she knew her grandma and why she has these powers all of a sudden. But first she has to deal with those aliens. Usually in movies and stuff, when someone says, "I'll explain everything later," that means that one of these people is going to die and they're not actually going to be explained to later. Yaira tells Altona to keep Stefania safe and that she'll be back. And this is what I meant about the continuity being weird. Yaira flies to Alpha Core's base late at night and she talks to Solari, he's just there. He's just hanging out at the Alpha Core base. I'm wondering what happened to the aliens and the Bugman. They were all fighting and then they just stopped off screen, I guess, and everyone went home. It's 5 o'clock, they all clocked out. Yaira and Stefania snuck away, sure, that makes sense. The aliens had their hands full with Alpha Core, so they couldn't pursue. I feel like the result of that fight was a bit open-ended as to who was winning, but if both parties were going to separate and everything was going to be reset, I think we probably should have seen that on screen. Not really a huge criticism, it's just a little weird. Anyways, at the Alpha Core base, Yaira tells Solari that she's going to go deal with those aliens and that she wants Solari to keep Stefania safe. Solari asks, who is Stefania to her? Yaira explains that Stefania is actually a distant descendant of hers. There's a flashback sequence and we see that Yaira arrived on Earth a long time ago, centuries ago, possibly longer. She meets this Viking guy, they fall in love and have kids together. Yaira stays with the Viking, named Gorm, and they raise a family together. He gives her his ancestral sword. They end up having 6 kids, but Yaira is an alien with a very long lifespan, and she ends up outliving her husband Gorm, and all of her children and grandchildren. She leaves before the great-grandchildren start dying off. At some point, Yaira lost contact with them, but she had to have some idea about where her descendants eventually ended up, seeing as how she knew where Carmen was in that retirement home. Stefania must be a very, very distant relative, seeing as how she lives in Texas and is Hispanic. Yaira had kids with Vikings practically in the Arctic. Stefania must be at least 6 or 7 generations from Yaira, seeing as how Stefania's abuela was also Hispanic. At the very latest, Yaira would have arrived on Earth in the 1800s, but seeing as how her husband Gorm gave her a sword and that he worships pagan gods, she probably arrived much, much earlier than that. This explains why Yaira has been so protective of Stefania this whole time. She's a very distant relative of hers, but more importantly, she's her only relative, and she's the only relative of Yaira's that's actually inherited her powers. Presumably, Stefania would have also inherited Yaira's long lifespan too. Yaira decides to fight the aliens in that place where she met her husband Gorm all those years ago, in the tundra outside this volcano. She meets with the 2 aliens and the Bugman once again. This time though, Yaira is determined to end things one way or another. She lures them to the volcano and they summon these diamond monsters to fight her. She breaks the crust of the volcano before the others realize that she's brought them into a trap. Her plan now is similar to her plan before when when she blew up the oil rig. These aliens seem to be weak to fire. Yaira breaks through the crust of the volcano and lava spews forth, killing the 2 aliens and their diamond servants before one of the aliens leaves an ominous message that more will come to bring Yaira to justice. The Bugman is still alive though, and he gets the drop on her. Yaira herself is hurt pretty badly because of the lava. She seems to also be weakened by it. She's in no condition to put up a fight against the Bugman. Yaira runs away from him and very conveniently finds her husband's sword halfway lodged into a rock some distance away. Really, really lucky that no one found that sword, or that it hasn't decayed into nothing in the several hundred years it's been there since Yaira left. Maybe it's a magic sword like Excalibur or something. Yaira pulls the sword from the stone and beheads this disgusting insectoid creature that's been haunting the pages of this comic. So finally, Yaira can breathe a sigh of relief. Nope. The lava from the volcano she disturbed is now freely flowing toward a city in the distance. There's no Texas-based emergency services she can pawn this disaster off onto like she did last time with the oil rig explosion. Yaira decides to be a hero and begins shooting the lava from the volcano with her ice powers. But it's not enough. She's unable to stop the lava, and the fatigue from combat must be getting to her as she falls into the nearby water completely exhausted. Yaira seemingly accepts her fate as she slowly loses consciousness. As her vision fades though, she sees a silhouette of a person holding a trident in the water. Yaira awakens sometime later, still completely submerged somewhere underwater. Now she's wearing her iconic outfit from the cover though. This entire time throughout the entire comic she's been wearing gym clothes. This brings me back to my brief discussion about superhero identities. Now, maybe I'm just reading into this too much, but it seems that Yaira is different from Clark Kent Superman in that she doesn't even need a supersuit to be disguised as Yaira. Whether she's perceived as her alter ego Sally or her super persona Yaira seems to be based entirely on who she's personally identifying as at the moment. If she's wearing gym clothes, everyone around her, including Alpha Core, sees her as Yaira. But those are just gym clothes. What happens if she's her civilian identity Sally at the moment, and she just happens to go to the gym wearing gym clothes? Will she be recognized as Yaira? Because it's the exact same outfit as what she would wear as Sally. I guess I can't be too harsh on this point though. The superhero secret identity thing has always been a very weak trope to me, almost every time I've ever seen it. It seems like it's the same here. For a moment, Yaira thought that maybe she was dead and in Valhalla with her husband Gorm, and that this attire was a gift from the gods. She looks over and sees a statue of the figure she saw before. It's Neptune. It seems that this outfit is at least from Neptune, even if he isn't here himself right now. He saved her somehow, and hopefully also put up that volcano too. Hopefully. I genuinely wasn't expecting to see the pantheon of gods in the Rippaverse, but the one hint is all we get in this issue. We never actually see Neptune move. Before, it was just a shadow in the water, and now it's a statue. This does put the Hell region that Isom went to back in Isom number 2 under a different spotlight. If Neptune is a character, does that mean that Hades is? Are we going to run into Zeus? This does make me want to briefly go back to what I mentioned previously about why I hate powers being deactivated as a concept. Here we have Neptune. I'm unclear on how Yaira is connected to him, but would his powers be able to be deactivated by some MacGuffin device too in a prison? Wouldn't really make sense to me, and that's part of the reason why I think magical turn off this person's powers devices are dumb and lazy writing. Separately though, I am curious about Yaira's powers. She's listed as being an Accept, but she's not even human. Is an Accept a superpowered human, or is it just anyone with superpowers? Because those aliens that came to arrest Yaira seem to be the same species and they also had powers. If everyone of Yaira's species has those powers, are they really superpowers? Maybe to mankind they are, but independently they're not really. I can see that superpowers in a human being like Solari put him on an even playing field with Yaira, but the natural state of a human is not that of whatever species Yaira is. Except seems to be a very wide net. It seems even wider than the X-Gene in X-Men, because this spans beyond humans. Funnily enough, this is sort of addressed directly in Isom number 1 actually, the fact that Accept is a very broad term. I'm curious to see this explored more as time goes on. Back to the story. We return to Stefania. Altona has locked Stefania behind a laser wall at Projexis to keep her safe. Eventually, Alpha Core arrived and took her back to jail. If you remember, Stefania was a part of a gang of bank robbers before all this started. Solari is talking with some jailers about what her eventual fate is going to be. It seems that she's destined for the J. Sully ward where they keep all the Accepts. I still would like to see how they imprison Accepts explored more in future issues. Solari walks past her cell and overhears Stefania crying while praying. She's sobbing about how she wants another chance and for God to forgive her. Solari interrupts her and tells her it's time to go. He tells her that prison isn't the only option for her and that he's willing to give her a second chance. Sometime later, we see Stefania in an Alpha Core uniform shooting targets at a range change with her powers. Solari is there training her, and Stefania is saying how she looks forward to being the one to kill Yaira. We see Yaira some distance away, watching this in secret with a sad look on her face as the comic ends. Yaira number 1 is by far my favorite so far. This blows ISOM 1 and 2 and even Alpha Core 1 out of the water. I still am really fond of Alpha Core 1, but I feel like Alpha Core 1 suffers from being just a setup for things to come. Alpha Core 1 definitely helps Yaira 1 in that no time is wasted here introducing who Solari or the others are. The pace was very fast, there was almost always a ton happening. This comic is shorter than ISOM 1 and 2 and I think the same length as Alpha Core 1, but it really didn't feel that way. Something I noticed though that might be why it felt like that is the amount of panels per page. Yaira 1 usually had 6 or more panels per page. Alpha Core usually only had like 3 to 5 panels per page, but they were larger. At times, Yaira number 1 could feel a little claustrophobic because of all the extra panels, but the story had me hooked really early into it. This almost feels like a direct sequel to Alpha Core number 1. For people who are trying to get into the Rippaverse, I'd recommend starting with Alpha Core 1 and then Yaira 1 right after. We'll see where ISOM fits once ISOM 3 is out. Yaira number 1 is going into the Secretly Immortal collection I'm currently assembling. It's a trope I really enjoy. I'm wondering what's going to happen with Altona now that she knows Sally is actually Yaira. It's going to be really awkward when Altona figures out that Yaira threw her brother Avery, Isom, into the car. Because right now, Altona is the only one that knows both Yaira and Isom's identities, as far as I know. I think it's pretty cool how heavily Alpha Core was featured in Yaira number 1. It kind of does feel like required reading. It really humanizes Solari a lot more. I noticed an interesting parallel between Solari and Yaira. They're both really powerful, basically evenly matched, but they seem to be on the opposite ends of the same coin. Solari is a member of Alpha Core and a police officer. As we saw in Alpha Core number 1, Solari has a hard time with procedure, but at the end of the day, he's a force for order. Yaira, on the other hand, is a force for chaos. She doesn't like getting close to people because she's ageless and she's eventually just going to watch whoever she gets close to age and die. But it's interesting because she does have a lot in common with Solari. Solari makes reckless decisions at times and people die. Wilkins died because of Solari's poor planning back in Alpha Core number 1. Yaira's descendant, that old woman, Stefania's grandma Carmen, died because of Yaira's poor planning. When Yaira went to go see Solari and asked him to take care of Stefania before she flew off to the fight, I feel like she did that because she recognizes that the two of them, they are kind of similar in some ways. It's interesting that as much as this is a Yaira story, it's also an Alpha Core story. We even got the origin story of a new Alpha Core member, and the Alpha Core themselves played a large part in the story. I will say that as much as I liked Yaira number 1, it's not perfect. I think there is this strange trend where characters will be in an action sequence and later everything is reset off screen. I mentioned this very early in the start of the comic with Alpha Core being thrown into space by Yaira, and again later with Alpha Core versus the aliens. It's not a huge problem, it's just something I noticed. Maybe that's due to the slightly shorter page length compared to the others. I was going to review Salvage as well, the short comic included in the first Ripazine, but it's really short, so I think I'm going to wait until there's more available. I don't know if Salvage is going to be a full comic at some point, but the vibe I'm getting is that maybe it's going to be released in small bursts with the magazine. That'd be a real neat homage to old comic strips and newspapers. This video took me a lot longer than I was planning, but at the same time, maybe not as long as I thought it would, if that makes any sense. I'm looking forward to reviewing these comics as they come out in the future. So if you made it this far, go ahead and give the video a like, maybe subscribe if you want to see more of these, and check out some of the other videos in the channel if you like this one.